videos for.
No, this is in the first year.
No, she's right in front of the Wesley's in front of the teacher. No.
Ooh, Wesley. Taking the whole night? Yes. How can I buy a copy of this from
Dick Holt. Dick Holt. He's in the. I'll tell you what. I'll give you my card.
Thanks.
Oh, we got it. Welcome. Thank you very much. My name is Laura Joss, and it's a pleasure to see you here this evening. I am the director of the New Horizons Band program through the Baldwin Wallace College Outreach Office. This is always a special event for us, a very proud event, is that for many of our New Horizons Band members, this is their very first concert, and they're very excited to perform for you. For those of you that might be in attendance this evening and have not heard of the New Horizons Band program before, although we don't know how, we've been on the radio and everything else these days, that we are an adult beginning band program. So we have 3 different populations with our group, those that have played but many, many years ago, those that may be joining us on a completely new instrument to them, and yet a third group that has never played an instrument before, never read music, and in 12 short weeks they've been able to put together quite a nice program for you this evening. So, I will tell you that the context of our program, we're going to be a bit on the informal side this evening because it's a challenge for some of our members to get up and down the stairs and in and out of the chairs. So please forgive us as we make those transitions. Not all. Somebody. But some. So, with that said, we will start with the beginning band, the class of the fall of 2003. I just have to take a moment and share. That was such a nice thing. There were signs in the balcony for a family that said proud. And we're oh so proud too. I recall last year, the holiday concerts, we were coming in through the back to bring the ensemble in, and most of the folks, that was their first concert. And a couple of the gentlemen were kind of holding my arm, and they squeezed really hard, and they stopped. And I said, "Are you okay?" And they said, "You know, I don't think I've ever had anyone in my whole life applaud for me." So it's just those wonderful kind of moments. And we just had one, kind of a hallmark moment as we call them, when I said, "Okay, it's time for the beginning band to take the stage," and the gold band cheered and gave them a high five. So it's a win-win for everyone, so I just had to share. Our next selection is Saints Go Marching In. That first one was We've Got Spirit, and that's come to be our theme song, because we certainly do have spirit around here, but we're very proud of our program. We're one of the largest programs in the United States, and we're very pleased that we have such wonderful support from these area communities. Before we play this next piece, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment and introduce you to some very important folks who, without them, frankly, we couldn't have this program. I have many little elves that that are working behind the scenes and plugged in, helping us both in a teaching capacity are quite a number of my music education students. One of the reasons that we decided to put together a program of this nature was to provide a lab experience for our young music educators to be able to practice teach. And it's just been a wonderful experience. We've learned that actually it's our adult students that are teaching us a great deal about life and music. So at this time, I would like to first initially, there are a number of teachers in the audience, to ask those regular teachers. We've got certified teachers from the area public schools, many of which who are BW alums, as well as college students who are here either on a volunteer basis or here because they're just really outstanding freshmen who decided to start early and are heavily committed. So could I ask you all please stand to allow us to recognize you with our applause this evening, would you please? All of my students. Thank you so much. They work very, very hard, and I am incredibly indebted to all the time that they spend in support. I'm so excited when I look at the future and I see such great teachers at this level. I know that they're going to make big differences in the lives of children when they graduate from BW. So, now we'll move on to St. Nick's Salsa. forever, despite my wishes, and so many of them have gone on and have very successful careers in the area. The next young lady that will be conducting the ensemble is one of our assistant directors, who is currently an elementary band director in Elyria City Schools. And, yes, and her name is Miss Michelle Neubauer. Okay, as we're getting settled here, this is our gold band. This ensemble is made up of a variety of folks, a little bit from all those populations I described to you early. Literally, there are some people here that just started their instruments last fall, and they've really been working hard. Many take private lessons and have really found and rediscovered the joy of instrumental music in their lives. In fact, we have quite an interesting makeup to our ensemble, and I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment here and point out to one of our unique members that we have in the ensemble. Back here in the second row in the sax section, we have Spike, one of our adult band members, and his grandson Ryan. Would you two gentlemen please stand up? They play together in band every Wednesday. I believe, correct? And his grandpa shared with me that they were a featured ensemble at the St. Richard's Christmas concert, so we wanted to make sure they were here too. So they're probably for hire. You can talk to them in the lobby after the concert. So, with that said, we're going to move on to our first selections with the Gold Band, and I'm introducing a new conductor, yet another Baldwin Wallace alum, and she is a band director at Cloverleaf City Schools, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Miss Christina Santelli. Before the Gold Band plays their last tune, I just want to assure you and tell you that we're always looking for new members for our program. So I know as a musician myself, I have been approached by countless folks that have said, gee, I wish I would have stuck with those lessons. My mom told me I should have practiced. And so now's an opportunity, if you didn't have that chance before, to join us. People always miss the point. They think they need to know how to read music, or somewhere along the way someone's told them that they can't read music, or they're not good singers, or whatever the case might be. But we've had a number of folks that were able to share with us. They might have heard that when they were in kindergarten, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we've proved them wrong. So we would love to have you come and learn and discover your own music yourself here at Baldwin Wallace College. I want to emphasize a couple of things. Previously, we are one of the program offerings through the BW Outreach Department. They offer many, many other programs. If you were interested in beginning piano lessons or beginning voice lessons, there is something for everyone here. This place is hopping about 7 days a week. I would also like to share that we are very, very grateful for the support that we receive on an ongoing basis from the ILR, which is the Institute of Learners in Retirement. Those folks were so kind. We approached them, oh goodness, I guess a year and a half ago, and said we had this idea for a program, some startup funds to purchase music and equipment, percussion and whatnot, to kind of hold us over until we could gain the enrollment that we have. They were very generous and continue to support us with scholarships and help for our students. So we are eternally grateful for their support and vision to back us and give us what we needed to get going. So if you're at all interested, we start a new beginning class at the end of January. I believe it's Wednesday the 28th. And if you have no idea what instrument to play, all the better. My students come on that evening and we set up tables and you get to honk on every single instrument and give it a whirl. And you might discover your inner trombone, trumpet, or flute player that you never knew existed. So please join us, because we're always looking for having new members to join the band. This next tune, I did want to say we'd like to dedicate this tune this evening to one of our members that could not be with us tonight, Miss Anna Lee Michaels, who is one of our trumpet players. We found out we had dress rehearsal on Monday night, and Tuesday she was hospitalized for heart trouble. So she's in our thoughts and prayers this evening, and we have so many of our members and families members who have been and served in the armed forces that we'd like to dedicate this to them and recognize them for the commitment that they've made to us and our country. Thank you. something a little bit different this evening. As our program has grown, there has been a continued interest that's developed with chamber music. Mr. Steve Gardner, he's the college student in the middle, is one of my instrumental pedagogy students, and his assignment, his final exam for his class this semester was to work and coach on a group of adult students with some chamber music. And I think he's done a smashing job, and they've had a good time doing it. So we couldn't be more pleased that they're going to present the 3 selections for you this evening. I know you'll enjoy them. Tuba Christmas Ensemble.